Somewhere along those highways in the late 80s, someone had already begun watching. In December 1989, two young travellers set out on a journey along the same highway. They were James Gibson, a 20-year-old Australian man from Victoria, and Deborah Everest, a 19-year-old from Melbourne. The pair had met while travelling. Like many young backpackers, they were making their way north through New South Wales. Their journey should have been simple, just another stretch of road between cities. But somewhere along that route, something went wrong. Because after leaving the highway, James Gibson and Deborah Everest were never seen alive again. At the time, their disappearance raised concern among friends and family, but the connection to Belanglo State Forest had not yet been discovered. That truth would remain hidden for years, buried beneath the trees, waiting to be found. And as investigators would eventually discover, James and Deborah were not the only travellers who had vanished along those roads. Next, we tell the story of the first victims and the journey that led them into Belanglo State Forest. In the summer of 1989, the highways running between Melbourne and Sydney were busy with travellers. Holidaymakers, truck drivers, backpackers moving between Australia's major cities. Among those travellers were two young people whose paths had crossed during their journey: Deborah Everest and James Gibson. Deborah was 19 years old, from Melbourne. Friends described her as adventurous and independent, the kind of person drawn toward new experiences, someone who wanted to explore the world beyond her hometown. James Gibson was 20, also from Victoria. He had been travelling through Australia, moving between cities and meeting people along the way. Like many young travellers at the time, he relied on hitchhiking to move between destinations. It was common, normal, and for most people along those highways it worked without incident. At some point during their travels, James and Deborah met. They decided to continue part of the journey together. Two young travellers sharing the same road, the same plan, the same excitement of seeing what lay ahead. In December 1989, they were travelling north along the Hume Highway, the major road connecting Melbourne to Sydney. For hitchhikers, this route was one of the easiest ways to move between the two cities. Cars passed frequently, drivers were often willing to stop, and the journey could be completed in stages with multiple rides. But somewhere along the highway, Deborah and James accepted a ride that would become their last. The exact moment remains uncertain, the location unknown. What investigators would later piece together suggested the two travellers had been picked up by someone who appeared helpful, friendly, just another driver moving along the road. Instead, they had encountered a man who had been watching those highways for opportunity, a man who understood exactly how vulnerable hitchhikers could be. At some point during the journey, Deborah Everest and James Gibson were taken into Belanglo State Forest, a vast area of bushland stretching far from the main roads. Once inside the forest, the isolation is immediate. The sounds of traffic disappear, the trees grow dense, and the red dirt tracks twist deeper into the bush. It is the kind of place where someone could vanish without anyone nearby noticing. What happened next would remain hidden for years, because after entering Belanglo State Forest, Deborah Everest and James Gibson disappeared. For their families, the disappearance was confusing and frightening. At first, it was possible to believe there had been misunderstanding. Travellers sometimes changed plans, routes shifted, phone calls home were delayed. But as time passed, the silence became impossible to ignore. Something had gone wrong. Police were notified, investigations began, but with hitchhikers, the trail often disappears quickly. There are no tickets, no passenger lists, No confirmed final location, just a stretch of highway where someone accepted a ride from a stranger. For several years, the fate of Deborah Everest and James Gibson remained unknown. Their names became part of a growing list of missing travellers. Unanswered questions scattered across thousands of kilometres of Australian highway. Then, in 1992, the search inside Belanglo State Forest changed everything. When police began uncovering human remains in the forest, investigators realised they might finally have answers for several long, unsolved disappearances. Among the victims discovered were Deborah Everest and James Gibson. Their bodies had been concealed in separate locations within the forest. The discovery confirmed what their families had feared for years. They had been murdered. For detectives, the significance of that discovery was enormous, because Deborah and James had vanished in 1989, but the other victims found in the forest had disappeared years later, which meant something deeply disturbing. The killer responsible for the Belanglo murders had been operating for years, using the same forest, the same methods, the same highways where backpackers waited for rides. The deaths of Deborah Everest and James Gibson would eventually become recognised as the earliest known murders connected to Belanglo State Forest, but they would not be the last, because in the years that followed, more backpackers vanished along the same highways, and their stories would lead investigators back to the same place, the same forest, and eventually, the same man. Next, 2 young travellers from Britain, and another journey that ended in Belanglo. Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters. By the early 1990s, Australia had become one of the most popular destinations for young travellers from Europe. For many backpackers, it represented freedom, a place where the journey itself mattered as much as the destination. People travelled light, moved between cities, met strangers who quickly became friends, and followed the long highways that connected Australia's vast distances. Among those travellers were 2 young women from Britain, Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, both in their early 20s, both exploring Australia together. Caroline had grown up in England with a curiosity about the world beyond home. Friends later described her as warm and outgoing, someone who embraced the adventure of travelling. Joanne was quieter, but just as excited about the journey ahead. The 2 had become close friends during their time in Australia, and like thousands of other backpackers, they were making their way along the roads between cities, moving gradually through the country, stopping wherever the road led them next. In April of 1992, Caroline and Joanne were travelling through New South Wales. They were hitchhiking south along the Hume Highway, the same major route connecting Sydney and Melbourne. It was a familiar route for backpackers. Cars passed constantly. Drivers often stopped to offer lifts. Most rides lasted an hour or 2 before travellers were dropped off and continued the journey with someone else. At some point during the journey, Caroline and Joanne accepted a ride from a driver who appeared willing to help them continue south. Someone who looked like just another motorist travelling the same road. Someone they believed they could trust. But somewhere along that route, the journey changed. The car left the highway and the road led into the bushland of Belanglo State Forest. Belanglo was remote, dense forest stretching far beyond the roadside, tracks winding deep into the trees. Once a vehicle left the main roads and entered the forest, it quickly became isolated from the outside world. It was the kind of place where someone could drive for kilometres without seeing another person, and once inside, the silence of the bush replaced the sounds of the highway.